There are so many wonderful parables that Jesus has taught. Parables that are familiar, parables that we love. Last week we looked at the lost coin and the lost sheep, the lost son that follows the prodigal son. I think of the parable of the four seeds being sown on the four different types of soil. There's the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's the parable of the separation of the sheep and the goats. There's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. There are so many wonderful, wonderful parables. And then there's this one, a sign for today. A parable where Jesus praises a dishonest manager who cheats his master out of goods. And we wonder, what in the world is going on here? How do we look at this parable? What is Jesus trying to teach us? It's one of those head scratchers that cause scholars to really wonder, what is Jesus talking about anyway? One of the people I read most weeks is a pastor by the name of Brian Stoppage, who has a detailed look at the coming week's gospel text. This last week, he looked at 8 different possible ways to interpret this text. None of them really which are satisfactory. And I wondered myself, what is Jesus talking about? And I remembered this book that was on my shelf. It's called Parables of Grace. It was written by Robert Capon. He's an Episcopal priest who was a lecturer at our Fall Theological Conference maybe about 10, 12 years ago. It's been a while, and I remember listening to him. And he had an interesting way to interpret the psalm, and so, the parable. And so most of what I'm going to be sharing is ideas that he presented in his book. They're not my original ideas because I have really struggled with this parable. I think the question comes to us, where does this parable end? When the gospel writers wrote the Gospels, as all of the New Testament writings, there were no chapters, there were no verses, there were not even any punctuation marks, and so it was just one line after another line. And scholars later on came in and put the chapters and the verses and put in the punctuation marks and divided the parables as they think they should. And I think most scholars have tended to look at this parable as dealing with wealth. And so they maybe think the parable ended with verse 12, or verse 9 rather. And Capon argues that maybe the parable ends sooner than that. They also have looked at this as being then connected with a parable that follows a few verses later, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And so what Jesus is dealing with is the topic of wealth in this parable. And of course that causes us to scratch our heads, because if Jesus is dealing with the parable of wealth, then are you supposed to be dishonest with the wealth that God has given you? Capon argues that he believes the parable, at least a case could be made, ends with verse 8. At least the first half of verse 8. And his master commanded the dishonest manager, because he had acted shrewdly. That Luke added all of these extra verses, which were sayings of Jesus, and he wanted to include them in his gospel, and they kind of tied in with the previous parable, and so he added these to his gospel text to get them in there. But then Capon also says that he believes that these parables this parable should be connected not with the one that follows, the rich man Lazarus, but with the 3 that preceded it. And I want to look at those a little bit more this morning and see if we can get a clue from those 3 parables of what Jesus is getting at in this parable. As we read last week from chapter 15, the parable, that chapter begins with these verses. Now the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus then commenced to tell 3 parables, I would argue 4 parables, against this accusation that he eats with sinners and tax collectors. As we looked last week, the first parable was that of the lost sheep. The second parable was the lost son. The third and longer parable, which we really didn't look at last week, is the parable of what's called the prodigal son, I would say the lost sons. And then we get the fourth parable, which is the parable today. As we look at those three parables, what are the characteristics of those? And I mentioned those are all gives us the understanding of God. They're pictures of God and God's characteristics. And I mentioned two of those last week. That one of those characteristics is the foolishness of God. As we look at this first parable, the parable of the lost sheep, I mentioned how foolish that shepherd really was. That no one in their right mind would leave 99 sheep in the wilderness to go look at one for one lamb, risking losing the 99 others. You cut your losses, take care of the 99 good ones, and forget about the lost sheep. No woman in their right mind would spend a whole day searching for a coin, and then when she finds it, throws a party that costs more than that one coin she found. Also, the shepherd throws a party. I mean, what farmer would show a party because he's found his lost cow? I mean, it's just the foolishness of it. And then we get to that third parable, the parable of the prodigal son. The son who really treats his father as dead, takes his inheritance, squanders it away, wants to come back and be welcomed back as a servant. He was hoping that his father would at least take him back so that he might have a square meal a couple times a day. And the father would have been very generous in taking this wayward son back, who had squandered away all of the money, had lived a loose living. But what does the father do? The father really acts very foolishly. Puts sandals on his feet, ring on his finger, coat on his back, robe on his back, and then goes and throws a party, buying or getting the best calf out of the pasture for the party. Pure foolishness. All of his neighbors would have thought he'd lost his rocker. You just don't do that. Yeah, have him come back, see if he's going to live under my roof, follow my rules, really is sorry for what he's done wrong. Don't treat him the way you do as a son. He doesn't deserve to be treated as a son. But all three of these parables also deal with the topic of forgiveness. Jesus, after the first and second parable, says there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 who doesn't. Over the emphasis on repentance and the joy that brings. And of course, we see that repentance in this parable of the prodigal son, where the father forgives his son for what he's done wrong. So with those in mind, let's take a look at this parable today. I think the question we need to ask, is Jesus present in this parable? Is it a parable about God? Is Jesus there? And I believe that Jesus in this parable is the manager. The manager who is squandering his master's property. So what property was Jesus squandering away? We have to go back again to the accusation. He was associating with sinners and tax collectors. What Jesus was squandering away was God's love. How dare Jesus show God's love to sinners and tax collectors? They don't deserve it. Why is Jesus doing that? He's squandering away God's precious love, which is intended for the good people of the children of Israel, for the scribes and Pharisees. And so what does Jesus do? He even acts a little bit more foolish. I mean, how many of us would love to be called into the bank? Wells Fargo calls you in and says, well, yeah, I know you owe $100,000 on your home. Tell you what, I'm going to take $50,000 off. You owe $50,000. No business place would stay in business long doing that foolishness. Or say the John Deere dealer says, yeah, I know you bought a new combine. You still owe $100,000 on it. Tell you what, I'll take $20,000 off and you owe $80,000. Again, the foolishness that we see in this parable, that Jesus was acting foolishly by offering, by sharing, by giving his love, his forgiveness to those that were around him. And then we get to the end of the parable, and it says, and the master commended the dishonest. The Greek word really has the root of unrighteous. The unrighteous manager. I think, again, we need to remember, all through this section of Luke's Gospel, Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. What's going to happen in Jerusalem is that Jesus is going to suffer and die, give his life for us. That Jesus becomes unrighteous, takes upon us all of his sin, so that we might be forgiven. So Jesus is the unrighteous one, who then later on is praised. Not by all of the scribes and Pharisees, but by some who follow Jesus, by the Jews, by the Gentiles, that after the Easter event, Jesus becomes the one who is welcomed into people's homes. And so again, here we have, I believe, a picture of the forgiveness that is offered, a picture of God's grace that comes to us, a picture of God's love that is shared to everyone, to the sheep, the lost lamb, to the coin, to the lost son, to the tax collectors, to the sinners, and to each one of us. And it is kind of ridiculous when you think of it, really kind of foolish. Because that forgiveness is amazing. It's offered to the man who has committed murder. It's offered to the sex offender. It's offered to the woman who's had an abortion. It's offered to whoever needs God's grace, God's love. The forgiveness is not restricted to those who are good enough or live up to our standards. It's offered to everyone, which leaves it in our hands. Because we have two choices. The one choice is to sit on the sidelines like the scribes and the Pharisees and complain about God's amazing grace. God shouldn't forgive that person. That person shouldn't be loved by Jesus. That person shouldn't be a part of the church. We don't want to associate with them. They're sinners. They've done wrong. They don't deserve to be forgiven by God. That's what the older son did. He sat on the sidelines complaining about his brother receiving the forgiveness from his father. He didn't deserve it. No, he didn't. But the father gave it to him. Or we have the option of joining in the party. The shepherd threw a party because the lost sheep had been returned. The woman threw a party because the coin had been found. The father threw a party because his son had returned. And Jesus was welcomed into homes and party with tax collectors and sinners because he loved them and forgave them. And so we can join the party, join the celebration, rejoicing in the forgiveness that God gives to all, including us. So the option is ours. Are we going to sit and complain about God's forgiveness to people that don't deserve it? Or are we going to party? Amen. We'll continue by singing.